greed. Even the greatest empires fall victim to it. The endless desire for more is always doomed with a downfall. This is the story of Minecraft's enchantments. Not too long ago, the overworld was ruled with an iron fist by the Illagers, mainly led by the evokers, the most powerful illager, and they had got to this point of ruling the world through a series of ruthless attacks on their enemies. Some of these enemies were very easy to overcome, others needed an entire century-long war to defeat, ending in the creation of a monster so terrifying that even the evokers allowed them to live independently. But while that monster did still live, it stayed far away from the evokers, and so it didn't really matter all that much to the evokers just yet. And so the evokers were ruling the overworld, and they had everything because of that. Endless riches, endless control of the land, and they'd even discovered how to become immortal. So what more could they possibly want? Well, they wanted even more power. But they wouldn't be able to achieve that through the items that they currently possessed, as they had experimented with everything. So did that mean that there was nothing there to make them stronger? Well, maybe. But there was a legend about a mysterious blue rock that had the power to control the overworld. The problem? This mysterious rock had been buried underground billions of years ago, and so, not knowing what else to do, they began searching for this mythical rock. However, for many centuries, they would end with no success, until one day, they found it. The evokers had been able to find a shard of this legendary blue rock, and the evokers were very happy. Now, while it may have not been the full thing, it was definitely enough for the evokers to want to start experimenting on it. And so they started out trying to infuse the shard with their magic. But what they ended up doing was a massive mistake. They ended up breaking this legendary shard into thousands of small magical fragments. As soon as that happened, many of the magical fragments started to melt into the ground, where they later multiplied in the stone below. But luckily, before they all sunk into the ground, the evokers were able to gather quite a few of them. And those magical shards were the Lapis Lazuli. Anyways, once these evokers gathered all the shards that they could, they tried to reconstruct them into one big block. And that worked to a degree, as they were able to create large magical lapis cubes, and they thought that these would act in the same way as the original shard, and so thinking that, they placed these blocks in the heads of massive statues of themselves in the hope that these massive statues would come alive, and then the evokers would be able to place their consciousness inside these giants, and with that they hoped to have the power to control the overworld. But not too surprisingly, that didn't work. But not to worry, the evokers had a plan to make it work, and that plan was to go to the nether and try again there. You see, it was easier for the evokers to cast spells in the nether due to the so they believed that the lapis would probably act in the same way, being that it would be easier to activate its hidden powers in the nether. And so they began to set up their massive statues in the nether. But while doing so, a few of the illagers also set up small stands for books to be placed on, so that they could record the results from this experiment. But there was a slight problem with that. The books and the stands, well, they were flammable, and there were a lot of fires in the nether. But not to worry, as the evokers then made fire-resistant stands, and so when everything was ready, they began to experiment. But wait, the ghasts showed up. Now, since the ghasts had never seen the evokers before, they thought that they were invading on its lands. So they began shooting at them. Now, that didn't do all that much damage to the evokers, and they were able to fight back very easily, but it was a severe annoyance that they had to deal with before they were able to start the experiments. So the evokers, just like they had done many times before, started to fight the ghasts ruthlessly. As a matter of fact, they even stole the tears from the eyes of the ghasts as they were being killed. And as such, many of the ghasts knew to stay far away from the illagers, but some still attacked, and that really annoyed the evokers, and so out of pure frustration, they casted a spell. A spell that made their bookstands and their statues invulnerable to the explosions from the ghasts, and so it was then that they were finally ready to start their experiments. But wait, there's another problem. Just as they were about to do their experiment, one of the evokers accidentally dropped a sword along with some of the lapis shards on the bookstands. But just as they went to pick these items back up, the lapis fused into the sword, and the sword began to glow. Seeing this confused that evoker a lot, and so it called out to the others, who all immediately ran over to see what had happened. And when they all ran over, they didn't quite know what to do. But that would change when one of the evokers foolishly decided to touch the blade, and because of that they were suddenly lit on fire, and that evoker ran to the unattended statue trying to cool off, causing it to also burn, as the statues weren't exactly fire resistant. Now, that wasn't exactly the smartest move, but not to worry, as another evoker was smarter and grabbed the sword by the hilt, knowing that they didn't need this strange giant anymore, as they had just discovered a very powerful new weapon. But just to make sure that this worked every time, they repeated what the first evoker did. However, this time the ability of the sword was different, and so it was at that point that they realized that these abilities could be gained for every weapon, and that each ability would be different. And so, for the next few months, the evokers would experiment with that magical book stand, eventually discovering that there were only a set number of abilities that they could get. Also, they found out by adding more books around the table that they would be able to transfer knowledge into the item, which made the ability gained from the Lapis more potent. And finally, they made sure to decorate these tables much better, as they were going to be using them a lot more from now on. And that table, by the way, well, it was the subscribing table. The enchanting table. And so it would be with this table that the evokers had found a new way to become even more powerful, to a point that they just couldn't improve on. But they wanted more. They wanted their own unique enchantment, one that only they could use, even if other mobs discovered the enchantment table. And the enchantment they wanted for now was one that would allow them to run quicker while being able to stay hidden. But as they were doing this in the Nether, where there was a constant interference of souls, they were only able to create a failed version of what they wanted, as they created the soul speed enchant. Now, while it may have been cool and had some very good uses for the Nether, the evokers didn't really want it, and so they left them all on the floor for the Nether civilizations to pick up if they wanted them, and they returned back to the overworld. So when they returned, the evokers repeated what they had done in the Nether, and they were able to create the swift sneak enchant, just what they had been missing to kill their only remaining threat. And so it was then that the evokers sent some of its most brave and powerful soldiers to the ancient cities. Here's what happened. They all went into the cities, constructing small towers for defense on the outskirts. As well as that, they brought in many different loud items to distract the warden. And then when they had the perfect opportunity, using their swift sneak enchant, they were all able to sneak up on the warden. And they died. All of them. Very quickly. You see, even their totems of immortality had been eaten up by the sculpt. And so it was then that the rest of the illagers should have stopped, and they should have been happy with what they had. But they were greedy, and they wanted the control of the entire overworld, and that included the Deep Dark. And so they started to use their magic again to give themselves visions. Visions of where they could go to defeat the sculpt. But what they saw were the warpers, a long past enemy of the evokers millions of years ago, and they were watching them leaving this world through a strange portal. But that wasn't too useful. They didn't know where this portal led to, what had happened to the warpers, or even where these portals were. Or did they? You see, they had actually found these strongholds long ago when they were hunting the warpers. But they had never truly explored the strongholds after they had watched the warpers disappear into the portals. But they had written down where they were. And so the evokers went to the libraries, searching for the right book, and now they knew where to go. So the illagers started to prepare for a journey to the unknown. The illagers did this by gathering up all the diamond enchanted items they had, along with any rare items they believed they could use in an experiment. And with that, they charged towards the strongholds, and they entered the portals. But this place that they had arrived to was not quite what they had expected. It was barren and bare, except for a few pillars in the distance. So, not knowing what to do, they all went to investigate, and it was there that they ended up finding the Ender Dragon. But the Ender Dragon was not there to help them. In fact, those visions that the evokers had, well, they were a trap set by the Ender Dragon to get them here. Because as soon as the illagers arrived at the Ender Dragon, all the non-evoker members were sent flying across the world to the outer end islands, where they were killed on impact. Also, all their precious powerful items were dropped, left for the Ender people to pick them up and use them for themselves. But what about the evokers? Well, the Ender Dragon needed them, hence the visions to get them here. Now, the reason for that was because she was a mere mortal, whereas the evokers had achieved immortality. So she was hoping that they could make her immortal. But when they obviously refused, she hypnotized them, forcing them to make her immortal, which they were able to do very easily through the tears of the dying ghasts, some glass, and some magic. and that's how the Ender Crystals were created. But once the evokers had done that, they became worthless to the dragon, as she now had exactly what she wanted. And so she threw them into the void, a place where their immortality tokens couldn't work, just to ensure that she was the only immortal in this dimension. Meanwhile, back in the overworld, the mansions of the once great Illagers now sit mostly empty. They could have been filled with life, but the Illagers were just too greedy for power and control, and that had caught up with them. But unlike the Illagers, there were the who just wanted to. Watch this video to find out about the tragic tale of Minecraft's ocean people.